All right, what's up, everybody? If it looks different, it's because I'm recording on my laptop. It's pretty weird, honestly. I'm so used to my camera. So we'll see how this goes. I'm using like an actual little software to do a true reaction video compared to what I normally do, which is record a video separately from the audio and then try and put them together. It takes like a full 8-hour workday to put together. So I figured I'm done with that. Let's actually find how to do this. So basically today's video reacting to Jeff Nippard's tricep tier list. There's going to be a few things I disagree with on here just based on some of the DMs I've gotten from people wondering what my thoughts are. So we'll see if these lifts are basement approved. I find a lot of the time in Jeff Nippard's comment section, people tend to just kind of blindly agree with him. I wouldn't say it's like the most dogmatic channel out there, but I do see definitely a lack of people disagreeing or challenging anything he says, which is interesting because he does have such a massive following. And that's nothing against Jeff, because I think he has great content and a lot of great takes. But even on like channels like mine, people disagree with me regularly. A lot of other channels kind of in this niche, it's kind of the same thing. But I think in Jeff Nippard's channel, a lot of people just use that as a go-to source of information and don't really question it. And I think it could be useful to see somebody challenge at least some of those ideas in that video. So with that said, let me figure out if I can do this. So
what are the best and worst triceps exercises for muscle growth? Well, in this video, I'll be ranking 20 of the most popular movements on a tier list from S for super to F for fail. And at the end, I'll crown one exercise as the best of the best and one as the worst of the worst. And to make sure your favorite tricep exercise doesn't end up in F tier, it needs to tick 3 boxes. 1, it must provide high tension, especially in the stretched position. 2, it needs...
Okay, so stretch and tension, fair enough. Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I think more so just challenging the length and position. You don't always have to have a crazy stretch, but I'd say it's a good thing. And then tension, I mean, every lift should have tension as long as it has tension in the stretch or in the length and position. In agreement with that.
It's to feel good, meaning it doesn't cause pain and it has a nice, smooth resistance profile. 3.
So smooth resistance profile is kind of a, I guess, subjective way to describe it. I would say if it's a mid or lengthened bias resistance profile, that's cool. If it's an awkward, like short biased one, those can be a little awkward. I critique those all the time on the channel. And yeah, if it doesn't feel right, if it gives you aches and pains, yeah, no point trying to force that. So I agree with number 2.
It needs to have a simple progression. That means you can easily add some weight or a rep from week to week. Now, as I'm sure you know.
Okay, so easily add a rep or weight from week to week. This kind of depends on how advanced you are as a lifter. Like there's going to be some lifts that you can just add reps and weight on for a long time because the increments are going to be small. And then there's some lifts that could just be a little bit lighter. So maybe like a spider curl or a dumbbell, some type of dumbbell curl where the increments are fairly large because it's unilateral. That can change how the progression scheme goes. So I'd say it's fairly subjective. The one thing I would look for is instead of a lift that allows you to make recordable or easily tangible weight and rep jumps, what I'd look for is a lift that doesn't change as you go heavier on that lift. So something that can match your strength progression really well, because as you get big, you're just going to get pretty strong. So that's part of it. And that's one thing I've learned a lot about as I've gotten bigger and stronger.
There are 3 heads of the triceps, hence the tri prefix. There's the lateral head, the medial head, and the long head. The long head beefs up your triceps from the rear. The lateral head gives the triceps that croissant shape, and the medial head runs down the middle, adding shape to the arm as a whole. And so when we're ranking exercises, we'll need to consider which movements will emphasize which aspect to ensure proportional development. Let's start with the most popular triceps exercise, the press down. Press downs will hit all 3 heads of the triceps, but probably grow the medial and lateral heads a little better than the long head. There are 3 main ways people do these: using a rope, using a bar, and using a reverse grip. The advantage of using a rope is that you can really drive the handles apart at the bottom, which will help some people feel a harder contraction in their triceps. Granted, this motion is mainly happening at the wrists, so I don't think it's adding a whole lot of real contractile benefit to the triceps. It's more of a mind-muscle connection thing. The downside of using the rope is that you just won't be able to load as much tension onto the triceps. Earlier this week, I did an experiment where I tested how many reps I could get using the rope versus using the bar while keeping the weight and my technique exactly the same. I got 12 reps with the rope and 16 reps with the bar. That's 4 extra reps at the same weight simply by using a bar. And that's because the rope attachment is far less rigid and stable, and so some of the tension coming from the cable stack is being lost through having to stabilize a loose rope with your forearms. And so while the rope might gain a point in the feels good department, it loses a point in the overload department. The rope press down is going in B tier. With the bar.
Okay, so I think part of that is just a difference in the moment arm. When you're holding a rope, especially with a neutral grip, you're not going to be able to stack it under your wrist. It's going to be closer to your fingers. That adds a few inches of distance between your elbow and the actual load that you're using. With the bar, you can really just put it right below your wrist. And that's what I do for my JM presses. That's what I do for my own push downs. I even have a flat bar, not for the sake of just using more weight, which I think is, at this point, it's pretty negligible, the actual benefits of just like using more weight, as long as there's not like a limiting factor that's preventing you using more weight, which the stability with the rope could be. I probably wouldn't overthink that quite that much, but that's definitely part of it. Yeah, either way, just kind of my 2 cents on the addition there. So in general, I would prefer the bar, but probably just for the weight difference, it's probably just the positioning in your wrist that's making that difference there.
Bar press down, the movement will feel a lot more stable, which will direct more tension to your triceps. The cable will provide more or less even tension on the triceps throughout the range of motion, and the bar should actually help you feel more locked in, which is a good thing. And you can easily overload by adding a little weight or a rep from week to week. The bar press down is very close to being an S tier, but because it never actually gets the triceps into a big stretch at the top, it isn't quite as good as some of the other options that we'll cover in a minute. And for that reason, it's going in A tier. It's definitely.
So these are both good lifts. My critique on here, in agreement with what he's saying, it's not going to be a length and bias lift, and it's not going to get you a major stretch. That's definitely one downside. They're also not very stable. You'll find that as you get stronger and the weight that you're using closes in on what your actual body weight is. I'm not saying you're going to be doing your own body weight for a push down, but as you get to like maybe 50% of your body weight or even 40% of your body weight, it just gets funky where the weight kind of lifts you up and you have a hard time generating force. That's my biggest critique of this lift. So for beginners, early intermediates, or anyone that's much heavier than they are strong, so you have a good like body weight to strength ratio, well, not I guess not good, but good for the sake of this lift, then it's fine. The stronger you get on this lift, the more awkward it gets, and that's why I would recommend an incline push down where you're lying back on an incline bench. Having all of that like friction and support on your back, it makes a major difference, and I don't think I'll ever do a regular push down again.
Definitely an exercise that I strongly recommend, and I do myself pretty much every single week. Now, the reverse grip press down is the worst of the 3 options, in my opinion. That's because turning your palms up won't actually change much for your triceps biomechanically, but it will limit their strength output, especially if your grip becomes a limiting factor. In my experiment, I actually only got 10 reps with an underhand grip, making it the weakest of the 3 options. Now, I know some people do really feel this variation hitting their triceps better, and that's probably because with an underhand grip, you can get your forearm bones out of the way at the top, but I really doubt it's worth the reduction in overload potential, and so the reverse grip press down is going in C tier.
Yeah, I would even put that lower. It's like if you're at a point where your wrist extensors, which are the muscles that's going to be resisting your wrist bending and holding onto the bar, at that point, if they're keeping up with your triceps, there's bigger issues in your training than kind of nitpicking which little tricep variations you're doing. So I would put that in the F tier. There's really no point doing that lift at all. Yeah, that's not the smartest move, and he already kind of explained that. But yeah, I mean, your wrist extensors, they just can't keep up with your triceps. So never do that.
Overhead cable triceps extension is a similar movement where you're just bending and extending your elbow, except for one crucial difference. You move your arms up overhead. This actually makes a world of difference for the long head. That's because the long head is the only head that crosses both the elbow joint and the shoulder joint. So all 3 heads of the triceps straighten the elbow out, but only the long head has a second function. It also performs something called shoulder extension, which is when you move your arm down. And that's exactly why you'll always feel your triceps working on dumbbell pullovers. The lateral and medial heads aren't doing anything, but the long head is working very hard alongside your lats and your pecs to pull your arms down. And so because it crosses the shoulder, it'll be more contracted when your arm is down, like in a press down or in a kickback, and it'll be more stretched when your arm is up overhead. You can even try this out for yourself. Put your arm back behind your torso and you'll feel your long head get rock hard, and you can lift your arm up overhead and you'll feel a really big stretch. And that's exactly what the overhead extension is doing. It's putting the long head under a much bigger stretch, but it's even better than that because the cable also provides super high tension in that stretched position. And I think that's why this 2023 study found that overhead extensions caused about 40% more triceps growth than press downs. Getting that long head into a more lengthened position seems to be doing something important for muscle growth. The overhead cable extension is our first triceps exercise going in S tier. Now, if you switch the bar,
So this is one that I would maybe disagree with a little bit. I don't think it's quite an S tier. I'd probably put that in an A tier. The reason being is it is less stable. And again, this is one of those things where the stronger you get, the more important of a factor this is. Uh, I just don't see how this could be an S tier when there's a better option simply by just adding like a seated stationary bench with back support, not only back support but also foot support, so you can keep yourself in the bench. After using a setup like that, I've never been able to like really go back to something like just a regular standing easy bar or cable overhead extension. There's still fine lifts if you don't have another option, but even myself, I find that I don't have another option for down here in the basement. I just don't even do them at all. I just stick to push downs, JM press, and a couple other lifts. So I think S tier is maybe a little bit of a stretch, just for the sake of more advanced or even intermediate lifters will struggle to keep that position, because when you don't have the back support, your elbows are going to track farther down, so you get even less of a stretch. And while you can still do the movement, it kind of defeats the purpose of that. So I have a hard time putting that in S tier when there's a better variation just kind of sitting right there. So I think A tier is probably more appropriate.
out for a rope, you'll still get all the benefits of training the long head in a more lengthened position. But again, the rope will limit your ability to overload the triceps to some extent. I don't actually think it'd make a huge difference over the long term, as long as you're pushing hard and you're tracking your progress. But I usually still prefer the bar, and so I'll put the overhead cable extension with the rope in A tier. The Katana triceps extension gets its name from how you draw a pair of Japanese katana swords, where you cross your arms overhead and grab the opposite side's cable. The best way to get into this exercise is to grab each side's cable with the same hand and then spin around 180 degrees while crossing your arms over. Or you can start with the cables crossed in front of you and then duck underneath and step through. Either way, if you start with the cables at around or just above waist height, you should end up with your arms in a position about 30 to 40 degrees forward relative to being flared out to the sides. This is called the scapular plane, which feels really comfortable for a lot of people. These also have the rare benefit of hitting both arms individually while still saving on time by getting both sides done at once. So that can be great for addressing any left-to-right imbalances while still not taking twice as long. These are definitely a personal favorite, and I'd probably put them in S tier, but because they require a bit more setup and they can have a bit of a learning curve, I'm going to go ahead and tentatively drop them back to A tier. The dumbbell.
So with those extensions, I mean, the learning curve and the setup, it's really not an issue. I wouldn't worry about that personally. I just don't see it as any different than just a standard cable overhead extension. I'd probably just put that in A tier as well. Um, but yeah, I mean, I still have a hard time because overhead extension variations are great for working the long head of the tricep, but they're also not really length and biased because the resistance profile is going to be, it really always will just be mid, even slightly short biased, even though your tricep is put in a stretch to start the lift. The resistance profile and the position are two different things. And I think that it all gets confused. And I actually filmed a rant about this topic earlier in the week. I decided not to upload it because I don't know, it just doesn't do any benefit. I figured I would just actually talk about these principles and those concepts in my videos. So a lot of people think an overhead extension, whether it's a cable or a dumbbell or an easy bar or whatever, they think it's a length and biased lift. It's really a short or a mid-range biased lift. Again, I talked about that in my resistance profiles video. If you want to learn more about how that stuff works, self-plug, I'd go watch that video.
French press will also get the long head very stretched and can be a bit faster to set up than cables. I like to do these seated because you'll be more stable, meaning you'll be able to direct more of that tension coming from the dumbbell directly to the triceps. One slight downside compared to the cables, though, is that the dumbbell will provide a circular resistance path, meaning you get a lot of tension on the triceps at the bottom and less tension at the top. It's not such a bad thing, though, because the stretched aspect does seem to be more important anyway, but I still prefer the more uniform feel.
Okay, so I disagree with that. If you're at the bottom, there's not much tension. Maybe if you stop halfway down or just beyond halfway down, technically that's like the bottom of the range of motion for that lift, but that's not the bottom for the range of motion of your tricep. If you really do go all the way down, uh, there's not going to be much tension down there, and you can kind of just hang out there forever. It's really that halfway up kind of mid-range point that is where it's going to be most difficult because the moment arm is tricky. So for a rule of thumb, it's when your forearm is going to be parallel to the ground. So
feel of the cables. My main issue with these is that as your triceps get really strong, the dumbbells may get so big and bulky that they're kind of awkward to handle, and it can put some unwanted strain on the wrists. I still like.
Yeah, maybe. I would say just use an easy bar. I've always preferred the easy bar anyways. I think it's more comfortable, especially with a closer grip. The dumbbell's fine. The only really concern with the dumbbells getting heavier and bigger is if they get girthier, for a lack of a better term, or if they just get so long that it actually hits the back of the bench, which is pretty annoying and limits your range of motion.
The French press, and I still include these periodically, but I do prefer the cables, and I'm going to put these in B tier. Doing these one arm.
B tier, that feels a tad low. I would put those in probably A tier. I think those are probably the best it gets for non-length and bias tricep lifts. I still don't think they're S tier. I don't think any of those overhead variations are S tier. Unpopular opinion. I'd put them in probably a mix of A and B tier, depending on what you're using. I really do have to reserve some other lifts for the S tier.
Arm at a time actually solves a few of those issues. This way you can find a good angle to point your elbows in that feels a little more comfortable on your shoulders. And because you're doing one arm at a time, the dumbbell will be less bulky and awkward. They still don't offer the same smooth tension as cables do, but they're a really good option.
I disagree with that. Dumbbells and cables will have the same tension. Of course, the cables you can manipulate based on just the height of the cable origin, but the actual resistance profile doesn't. The smoothness of it doesn't change. You can just change the actual resistance profile based on the height of the cable, versus on a with a dumbbell you couldn't really do that unless you were just to change like the bench angle or something.
Especially if you only have access to dumbbells. One arm dumbbell tricep extensions are going in A tier. All right.
Yeah, A tier. I'd probably put those in B tier. Just like my personal experience here, I have a hard time with high force output doing those unilaterally for whatever reason. They feel a bit awkward. It's still probably a light enough lift to where you're not really challenging your side to side balance, really. So that should be fine. But yeah, they do work in the scapular plane, so you'll find the same thing with an overhead extension. If you're going to do them single arm, you'll find you'll always end up in the scapular plane. You're not going to go directly back. You'll basically go almost like you're tapping your far shoulder, or your opposite shoulder towards like the rear delta area. So yeah, good lift. I wouldn't say they're great. I've never enjoyed them enough or gotten enough out of them to stick with them for longer than one session, but I'd probably put those a little lower. But maybe I'll do my own video.
So what about skull crushers? Well, let's see. They offer super high tension while the triceps are most stretched, especially.
No, I disagree with that too. I'm finding I disagree with a lot of the resistance profile and the stretch stuff. I don't know if it's just like semantics, but I would definitely disagree that there's high tension in the stretch. The reason for this is because if you can see the screen, well, I hope you can. I hope I'm doing this right. If you can see the screen here, the bar, so the actual resistance is not very far from his shoulder. If he's going to raise that up and he hinges on the elbow, the weight's going to end up basically twice as far from his shoulder as it is right now. So the problem with this is that is going to be a much weaker position because the weight is like quote unquote heavier because it's farther away, so the moment arm is greater. But your tricep is also in a weaker position because the resistance profile is going to be getting more challenging as you contract. So if you're limited by your strength in that lockout area when the bar is farthest behind him and the muscle is most shortened, which are both two factors that will make the short position very hard, then the tension at the bottom is not going to be very high. So I do disagree with that. If you're doing a pullover with a bent arm, you could make another case for that because the weight doesn't go so far behind you. And by nature, you're just going to be limited by that. But I would say the tension is not very high here. The long head of the tricep is in a fairly stretched position, but the tension is just not very high there. It really isn't. You can try it for yourself. You can hang out there all day.
Especially if you arc the bar back behind your head instead of literally stopping at your skull. They should feel good, especially if you use an easy bar, which can ease up some unwanted strain on the wrists. And they're a great movement for overloading the triceps, as you can always add a little weight or a rep from week to week. And even
yeah, they're a great lift. I'm not saying they're not a good lift. I do really like to use these. But I would say at this point with the whole like adding a rep or adding weight, like that applies to all these lifts so far.
Though you don't get uniform tension on the triceps, you can fix that by starting the range of motion with your elbows slightly back rather than straight up. This will immediately pull some tension into the fibers, and from there you can arc the weight back. I think this is my favorite free weight triceps exercise, and even though some people find them a little less smooth than cables, I think they're great. I do them a lot, and yeah, I think skull crushers belong in S tier. Dumbbell skull crushers.
So the stretch and tension in the stretch is one thing he was looking for to put into S tier, or basically to qualify for a good lift. I would definitely disagree with that one. It's a great lift. It's just not S tier. There's very few lifts for the triceps that meet those criteria, and I wouldn't say that meets them. I wouldn't say it meets his own criteria. So I can't see how that goes in S tier. But again, that's just my opinion.
Are the exact same movement, except you get to train each arm individually, which is nice. I'm not exactly sure why, but the dumbbell skull crusher always feels a little more awkward to me than an easy bar or straight bar skull crusher. Maybe it's because the dumbbells are free moving, and in that lying overhead position, I just find them harder to control. So while on paper, they should also be an
So I agree with him on this. The dumbbells are awkward. I think part of it is because basically I can't remember if it's deviation, but I think this is deviation when you're pressing forwards like this. Trying to resist that, it is kind of awkward. It's the same thing with resisting wrist extension. So I think that's what makes it feel most awkward. So if you kind of choke up on the handles and just let the dumbbells rest, it does feel a lot better. The one thing, the one advantage that the dumbbell skull crusher does have is you can track your elbow a little bit forwards. And this is my JM press bias starting to show here. So with a dumbbell, you can lower your elbow, and now you actually have tension towards the bottom when the triceps are more stretched. With that said, you are shortening the long heads. You're getting less activation there. But I would say you actually get more tension on the lateral head. So pros and cons to every lift. That's why there's really no like good and bad lifts. There are definitely lifts that are really good and definitely lifts that are really bad. But a lot of lifts, when you're talking about just lifts in general, everything kind of has its pros and cons, and you just have to be aware of them.
an S tier. In practice, I find them a little more awkward, and for that reason, I'm knocking them back to A tier. Now, the JM press is an interesting.
Yeah, A tier is good for those. Oh, let's go. Let's see what he says here. Better not be bad.
One. People who like this exercise really like this exercise. I think.
Yep, that's true.
I think it's a bit overrated in the strength and powerlifting space.
If he's referring to strength and powerlifting, maybe. You don't need to be super strong in the stretch anyways, so it could be useful for powerlifting, but just for the sake of adding size, but you don't need to be strong with your triceps in that much of a stretch.
It's really just a hybrid between a close grip bench press and a skull crusher. Instead of lowering the bar back behind your head like in a skull crusher, or lowering the bar down to your chest like in a close grip bench, you meet in the middle and lower the bar down to your chin area. I don't know.
So yeah, this is a very nuanced lift. Very nuanced lift. There's a bazillion different techniques you can use because it's a hybrid lift. So you're, like he said, you're combining a skull crusher and a close grip bench, and you kind of get the best of both worlds here. So there's a bunch of different places that you can have your bar path go to. The chin is kind of the default, but for some people, depending on your arm length, it could be as low as the clavicles or even the upper chest. So how to find this out? And you're going to have a spectrum of bar paths that all work. But a pro tip for the JM press, whether you're doing it with a barbell or a Smith machine, all you want is when you're at the bottom, so you're at peak resistance and you're lying on a flat bench, you want your elbow to be above shoulder height. I don't know if you can see this. You want your elbow to be above shoulder height, but below wrist height. You can be a little bit more skewed towards wrist height or a little bit more skewed towards shoulder height. And this will basically just dictate which of the two lifts in the hybrid it's biased towards. But either way, as long as you're within this window of shoulder to wrist height with your elbow, it's going to be a JM press and it's going to be a great lift. So if you're lower and the bar path is a little closer to maybe your clavicles or even upper chest, it's closer to a close grip bench, but it's still extremely tricep dominant. So that works. And if you're even up higher to where your elbow's closer to your wrist, maybe the bar path is to like your mouth or chin, it's still the JM press, but it just resembles a skull crusher a little bit more. So anything within that window, shoulder to wrist height, totally fine. It's still a JM press. It's still great. You're still maximizing tension in that bottom position. And I think that's what's key here.
I've been trying these for years, and I always feel a little elbow pain or at least a little elbow discomfort whenever I do them. So they're losing a point in the feels good department for me. Because
so his grip is a little too wide. That's one thing. You want your wrist to be directly over shoulder height. So that's usually about 2 fingers on the smooth, 2 on the knurling. That feels a lot better. You also should ease into these. Alex Leonidas has talked about that in the past. You want to slowly add weight and or range of motion to this lift, and it should feel good. Unless you have like a unique injury or a unique build that just doesn't align well with the lift, then that's totally fine. Not everybody can do every lift, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'd say the vast majority of people write these off because it hurts at first or feels awkward at first. So they don't nail it down at first because it is a hybrid lift. So just learning the technique is awkward because you're not taking the path of least resistance. You're combining 2 lifts. And that's where I think the Smith machine kind of has its magic because it keeps you in the perfect bar path. All you have to find out how to do is where to lie down, and then you just kind of lift from there.
Because your arms won't be as far back behind your head, the JM press also won't get the long head quite as stretched as a skull crusher will. And I think if you're already doing some bench press and you're already doing some kind of overhead extension, I'm not sure that you really need a JM press. That said, I am a fan of hitting the triceps from
Did you just say if you're already doing a bench press and an overhead extension, you don't need it? I have to rewind that.
bench press and you're already doing some kind of overhead extension, I'm not sure that you really need a JM press. That said, I am
Whoa, I completely disagree with that. That's probably one of my biggest disagreements of this video so far. A regular bench press should like optimize to train your pecs. You should not be getting too much tricep growth from. If you're lucky and you have good tricep genetics or you respond well to training, that's fine. But I would not. I'd be very skeptical of counting on the bench press to develop the lateral head of your triceps. The long head, yeah, obviously it's not working the long head on the bench press because as it shortens, it also lengthens at the shoulder joint. So similar concept with the long head to JM presses, but I would say a bench press is not taking you through a full range of motion. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy. I don't know if he's doing that on purpose or anything, but the bench press at the bottom, your elbows are getting to about 90 degrees, maybe a little less if you're using a big arch and a wider grip, maybe a little more. But either way, if the stretch and getting good tension in the stretch is a high priority, it's the number one thing on the criteria for these tricep lifts. I don't see how the bench press is even close to that. The triceps aren't even a prime mover on that lift, so that's a big disagreement for me. That's for sure. I failed miserably at growing my triceps by benching, even though I got a pretty strong bench. Um, and yeah, overhead extensions are great, but that's not even a length and biased resistance profile. And it does train the long head well, but it's still a mid to short biased lift. So I don't know. I just don't think that lines up with the criteria. I think in general, I agree with a lot of the stuff he's saying, but I think there's a few bigger points that have been missed here.
am a fan of hitting the triceps from a variety of different shoulder angles, and I do think that it's a solid lift that should have some strength carry over to your bench press. All things considered, I'm going to put the JM press in B tier as a
What? That is insane. This meets all of his criteria perfectly. Um, the only downside to a JM press is it can be a little awkward to learn, but even then, it's like that is not a reason to not do that lift. That I think that meets his own criteria perfectly. Yeah, I don't see how that's not even an A tier. I would put that in S plus plus. I think it's the best lift there is for the lateral head of the tricep, and I don't think it's particularly close. Like I just don't see how anything can compete with that. Putting that in B tier is that's a very strong disagreement from me. In his defense, this lift has always felt very awkward and painful for him, like you said. So every lifter, every YouTuber, everyone is going to have a little bit of personal bias. So I'm not going to fault him for that. It's his own personal bias, and that's part of YouTube. That's part of what it is. We're not robots. We're humans. We're people. So I'm not going to fault him for that. I think that's very fair. I'm just explaining my perspective, and I do strongly disagree with that decision.
muscle builder. The Smith machine JM press fixes a
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Can he can he make up here?
few of those issues for me. Where you're locked into a fixed movement path, I do find it easier to really focus on using my triceps to move the weight, whereas with the barbell, my pecs and delts can sometimes take over more. I like JM presses on the Smith machine a bit better personally, and so I'm putting them in A tier. Triceps kickbacks are one.
Okay. Didn't elaborate too much on that. He was mostly just talking about the bar path. Yeah, I mean, the Smith machine is going to be better than a barbell JM press. They're both excellent lifts. The barbell is just a little more awkward to learn, and the consistency might be off a little bit because it's a free bar, and a Smith machine solves that issue. But they're both great lifts. A tier, it's still low, especially if there's an S tier above that and an S plus for the top lift. So I don't know. I disagree with that. A is fine. I think again, I think that's more of his personal experience and personal bias, which we all have. And I'm not going to act like I don't have personal biases. But yeah, I do disagree with that. I think there's a lot of pros of the JM press that he didn't touch on here at all.
One of the very few exercises where you get to smash the triceps with the arm held back behind the torso. This is important because remember that the long head of the triceps will reach peak stretch when the arms are up overhead, but reach peak contraction when the arms are held back behind the torso. So this far, this is the first exercise we've covered that'll get the long head into a full squeeze. A lot of people do kickbacks bent forward, but if you think about it biomechanically, it's really the exact same thing as doing them more upright with the arm kick back. And even though there is research suggesting that the triceps respond better to long muscle lengths, it just isn't quite strong enough or robust enough for me to throw out every short and biased exercise. Plus, you can still get the lateral and medial heads decently stretched here, and the cable provides nice, even tension throughout the range of motion. They feel good to me, and I prefer to do these with slightly higher reps.
Okay, so the even resistance profile, again, I disagree with that. I don't think that makes any sense because there's still a cable origin that doesn't shift. It's a flat resistance profile from the actual weight itself, but there's still a moment arm in that lift, obviously with your elbow being the axis and your wrist being the load, or the attachment being the load, but at your wrist. So I disagree with what he said there, but overall I agree that it's a good nuance from him that just because length and bias lifts are usually going to be kind of the bread and butter and be the quote unquote better options, you shouldn't just ditch all short biased lifts. I still do short biased lifts too. And yeah, I respect that opinion a ton. I think I think it's a great take. And I think he's someone that the fitness industry as a whole, like everybody, myself included, has completely dumped tricep kickbacks, because obviously when the more length and bias stuff started coming out, we started just kind of hating these because they're more popular with dumbbells. But I think he's the one person that's kind of been like, hey, all right, nope, you guys don't understand this lift entirely. You can actually do it with a cable, make a better resistance profile. It's still not perfect, but you can still train the long head in a short position and get a full contraction, which I think is important. So props to him for reviving a lift that was like at the bottom of the barrel in the fitness industry's eyes for so long.
And really focus on getting a big, strong contraction in my triceps. Cable triceps kickbacks are going in A tier. Now, if you switch to
A tier is a bit of a stretch, but yeah, I respect his take on that. I'd probably put that in like probably very bottom of the B tier lifts.
dumbbell, you do make the exercise less effective. That's because the dumbbell offers zero tension while the tricep is stretched, and then tension increases as the muscle contracts. This isn't great because we'd want to bias tension toward the stretched aspect.
Yeah, when your tricep is fully stretched in this one, there's tension on your bicep. Yeah, that's a problem. This lift sucks.
As much as we can, and the dumbbell kickback does the exact opposite. That said, I don't think this is quite as big of a deal as people make it seem. The kickback is already better at overloading the shortened position, so the fact that the dumbbell's resistance curve leans into that isn't an automatic deal breaker. That said, if you do have access to cables, I definitely think you should do cable kickbacks instead. If you only have access to dumbbells, I think putting the dumbbell up overhead and doing overhead extensions will give you more bang for your buck. Dumbbell kickbacks are a little overhated online in my opinion, but they're still not one of my go-tos. I'm going to put them in C tier.
I'd probably put them in D or F tier. I think they're a fine lift. I would never program them for myself or a client. I would never recommend them either. But again, the more advanced you get, the resistance profile is it's such an extreme skew on this one towards the short range that if we're going to talk about one of his first points, which is adding reps or weight, so like your overall progression potential, which I think is an overrated concept personally. I don't see how that really meets any of his criteria. I would probably put that in D or F personally. C tier is fine. I think he's just trying to save the face of this lift, which I respect a ton because I think the fitness industry is prone to doing that, just dumping lifts for like one little nitpicky reason, but you're kind of missing the rest of the picture. So I respect his take on that for sure. C tier is fine. C, D, even high, like somewhere in the Fs. I don't know. That's probably fine. I'd have to see the rest of his list for context here.
Close grip dips are another exercise that'll work the triceps with the arms back behind the torso. So they offer a really strong contraction of the long head. But because the arms aren't up overhead, the long head never really gets a deep stretch. Dips also don't feel the best to me. I find my shoulders get a bit cranky if I do them too much or too heavy, but I know tons of people who can do them with no problem. The dip's biggest upside is that as a compound exercise, it's great for progressive overload. You can always add a rep or two from week to week and use a weight belt to add weight as you get stronger. So the close grip dip.
So with the progressive overload point, I guess if you see progressive overload as what causes growth and you need to find a way to add reps or weight um, to a lift every week, then that's a good option. I disagree with that because I think it's clear that like if you're training a lift to 0 reps in reserve and you need to add more, you'll be able to so for example, let me back up a little. Let's say on close grip dips, the exercise he's doing here. Let's say you do your body weight and your 200 pounds and you get 10 reps, 0 reps in reserve. If that's potent enough, you're probably going to be able to do 11 reps, maybe 12 reps for the following week or two. So you're not just choosing to add stimulus because you really can't add stimulus unless you're holding back which some people do. I don't agree with that method of training, but that's besides the point. Uh, I would say that the stimulus is top priority, and I think that's a clear example that stimulus is what causes growth. I have so many more videos going more in depth on that. I'm not going to try and explain that whole concept in this video.
Probably should be an A or S tier on paper, but because it doesn't feel the best to me, and I find my pecs and delts can easily take over, I'm dropping it back to B tier.
Even B tier, I think, is a little bit high for that. I think with dips, like your upper arm is still moving a lot. Like your chest is still the prime mover. If your arms are that far behind you, that's even more of a chest bias. So your chest is even more so the prime mover. So it's a little bit too high for me personally. I'd probably put that in like C tier, maybe high D tier. And then yeah, again with the long head, as it shortens at your elbow, it will lengthen at your shoulder. So it's hard to train the long head with these compound lifts. You do need to isolate the progressive overload point. I guess in some people's perspective, that's totally fine. I wouldn't say that changes anything for the left at all. I'd probably put that in somewhere in like C or D tier. The triceps aren't even really a prime mover there. And you're not going to get a full stretch either way.
Bench dips work the triceps in a similar shoulder position, and I do find these take my pecs and delts out of the movement much better so I can connect with my triceps a little more. That said, their fatal flaw is in the progressive overload department. As you gain tricep strength, the exercise simply isn't going to be challenging enough in a normal rep range, and then you'll need to add weight. You can have a partner load some weight in your lap, but I always find this a bit awkward to balance. All things considered, I'm putting the bench dip in C tier.
See, I'd probably even go a little bit lower than that. So I'm not huge on like, oh, this lift isn't that practical or it takes a minute to set up or whatever. I think that's fine. But I would say, yeah, yeah, nothing like seeing somebody do a lift where you're using like 2 of the flat benches out of like the 3 your gym has, and he has like 4 plates that someone's put on his lap, and one of them like falls off halfway through the set. And that lift it can be an absolute nightmare.
Machine dips are actually pretty solid. I don't do them a whole lot in my own training just because I like cable kickbacks better, but I might add these back in for my next training phase. They're really just a more locked in version of a free weight dip, except if you can find a good machine, you'll have a little more stability, which might help you connect with your triceps better. That said, I still find my pecs and delts can take over on some of these machines.
Yeah, so machine dips, it all comes down to your technique. So with machine dips, if you're just doing them like a regular dip with your hands kind of behind you and your elbows aren't bending a whole ton, then yeah, it's just like a kind of a souped up regular dip just because it has more stability and it's easier to set up. So that's fine. So I put them maybe a hair higher with all these little nitpicky points from regular dips. But I'd also say with a machine dip, with the extended handle especially, and it even feels better when you have an overhand grip. So you're not holding like a flat bar when your wrist is up like this. With the extended grip, where you can bring your hand way in front of like your elbow and much closer to your shoulder, it's basically like a push down and JM press combo. That is an excellent lift, and I think that is incredibly underrated, but nobody knows how to do machine dips like that. They don't really think about the actual biomechanics of the lift. So machine dips, they could be a terrible lift for your triceps in like D tier, but if you do them right, I'd probably call them like an S tier or an A tier lift.
So I'm going to leave the machine dip in B tier as well. Okay, the close grip bench press.
E tier, I'd put that I'd probably put it in S tier as long as your technique's fine. And again, this kind of depends on the machine too. I think most of them, especially the selectorized ones, you do have the ability to use that overhand or at least a very high grip, and you just get the most insane. You get the most insane amount of elbow bend. It's super high tension at the top. It's extremely stable and it's extremely comfortable. The handles are obviously they're neutral, they're rubber, and they have like something you can hold on to at the end. I think Matrix is the machine that makes these really well. Cybex, I'm pretty sure, has a good one too. But those are a great lift. And again, like the thing with compound lifts is your chest and your shoulders, they can take over, but it's understanding your grip, your setup, and your technique to bias one muscle over the other. Setup is going to be most important with that regard, like over technique. But I would also say if other muscles are working, that's okay. I think a lot of the lifting community and a lot of the biomechanics community, especially, they're trying to eliminate muscles rather than make the muscle they're trying to train the prime mover. And I think that's a major issue. So something like a machine dip, people are like, oh, well, my chest and my shoulders are going to assist in that. So I should just do a push down. It's like, no, the machine dip is great. What you want to do is make sure your triceps are the prime mover. And it's totally fine if you still feel your chest working, if your chest is still working, if your shoulders are still working, that's fine. As long as they're not the prime mover, they're probably not even going to get stimulated. And if they do, it's just bonus. Just make sure your triceps are the prime mover and you're good to go from there.
Press. Similar to the dip, its main selling feature is its incredible capacity for progressive overload. As your triceps get stronger, you'll be able to gradually add a little weight each week and
But JM Press doesn't have it. He didn't say that for JM Press. I'm offended.
keep your triceps growing for years to come. The bar will provide consistent tension throughout the range of motion, and to me, a close grip bench press feels great. Actually,
consistent tension, but you also have to touch on the fact that there's multiple muscles at play. And at certain points of the movement, certain muscles are going to be more active. So it really isn't consistent tension for each muscle. There's also not much of a bend at the elbows at all. So the triceps really aren't getting much of a stretch, and they're not getting much tension at the bottom either. So again, I don't think this meets his criteria. He hasn't scored it or touched on the whole thing, so I don't want to put words in his mouth.
find I can engage my triceps a lot better here than on dips. That said, there's a slight problem with the long head. While presses will smash the medial and lateral heads extremely well, the long head actually doesn't get hit all that hard. That's because it's lengthening at the shoulder joint while simultaneously shortening at the elbow joint. So
yes, finally somebody said it. I think I mentioned that earlier in the video, but usually nobody talks about that. They just act like it doesn't exist.
While I really want to put the close grip bench press in S tier because it is such a great overloading movement,
I mean, a lot of movements are good overloading wise, but overloading isn't even the right way to say it. Good progression wise or progression potential. Overloading is just training the muscle, but that's nitpicky. I think that's like a pop culture term versus like the proper scientific term or whatever. So I don't want to get nitpicky on that. But yeah, I mean, I'd still say that the key for progressive overload potential is how much does the lift change as you use heavier weights and add reps. That's truly what matters most, in my opinion. I made a video on that probably a month or so ago, kind of explaining that everybody's confused on this topic. So I would say it's not about potential for how much weight you can use. It's about potential for how much do your leverages of this lift change? How much do the mechanics of the lift change as you get stronger? And the close grip bench, while it doesn't train the triceps very well, in my opinion, and it's more of a chest, and yeah, maybe a little triceps in there, kind of a combo. The lift doesn't change as you get stronger. And I think that's why something like the bench press is a time-tested lift and why everybody's liked it for so long. It's because it doesn't get awkward as you get strong, like so many other lifts do.
I have to drop it back to A tier. Just
A tier is probably a little high for me. I mean, above JM press, it just that seems inconsistent to me from a criteria perspective. C tier is fine. Again, it depends on your grip width too. So if you're super narrow and you can stabilize it well, Smith machine preferable. I could put it in like C tier. I could see that. A tier is that's a major stretch in my opinion.
because I don't think that the long head will grow as well from these as they will from an overhead extension. But
I don't think the long head would grow really at all from those unless you're like a total noob. I mean, yeah, the point you said about how the long head lengthens and shortens at your shoulder and elbow, that kind of takes all the tension right out of that muscle.
definitely think it's an exercise that's worth doing if you're trying to grow your triceps. The close grip push-up has very similar biomechanics, so it'll also hit the lateral and medial heads harder than the long head. But the main issue with the push-up is that beyond the beginner stage, it's just really hard to overload them without doing a ton of reps or having a partner load weight on your back, which can be a pain. I'm putting these in C tier. Diamond push-ups make the movement considerably harder by narrowing the base of support, and most people can feel their triceps working harder with the more flared elbow position that it puts you in. I actually really like diamond push-ups as a finisher exercise at the end of a workout, where you can just go for as many reps as you can.
So these are kind of like a body weight JM press. It's less stable. There's potentially less range of motion here depending on how big of a person you are. But it's also so awkward to try and stabilize your hips, your abs, and your knees and everything. So I would just say, obviously, a JM press is better. But for anyone that is doing calisthenics or just has limited equipment, this is actually a pretty solid alternative to it. It's not perfect. It has its flaws, but it is pretty solid.
Can get. They're actually a lot harder than they look, and even though they're still not as good as a close grip bench press for progressive overload, I think they're just good enough to get into B tier. So here's what you need.
So yeah, I think the JM press, if you use kind of the same criteria for every lift, I don't think it makes sense that it's that low.
Need to know. First, pressing exercises will grow your triceps, but probably won't be enough on their own to maximize triceps development, especially.
Yeah, as a general concept, yes, I agree with that. I would still use tricep isolation or a lift where the triceps aren't being isolated, but they're the prime mover. So JM press, for example, I would still use those as your prime movers. I think a lot of people like to see the chest as like the prime muscle you're trying to train, and the triceps are just like kind of its little sidekick that will grow with it. And then you just throw some push downs at the end. And I think a lot of people end up with relatively small arms from that style of training, popularized with power building and I don't know, the whole fitness industry of the 2010s and early 2020s. So yeah, in general, I tend to agree with that, but I wouldn't bank at all on compound pressing where your chest or shoulders are the prime mover for growing your triceps. Like I wouldn't count on that at all. It's not half a set. It's not one set. It's just nothing. Just ignore it. That's my 2 cents.
Especially not the long head. Second, you should definitely do some triceps isolation work for maximum growth. Third, the most effective isolation exercise is one that trains the triceps with the arms overhead. This is
Um, Probably. Yeah, that's probably true. Number 3. Um, yeah, I would tend to agree with that. The I guess kind of nitpicky like little thing here is the JM press. I think a lot of people view it as an isolation, but it's technically a compound movement because there's multiple joints moving, but the triceps are the prime mover. So that's where it gets confusing with like the bros versus the science. And I would say if you're viewing isolation as how many muscles are you training versus how many joints are you working, which the joint one doesn't make a whole ton of sense from a bodybuilding program context perspective, but I'd say for a muscle growth perspective, like to me a Smith bench or a bench press, that's chest isolation. I'm only training my chest. Multiple joints are working, some muscles are assisting, but they're just in supporting roles, they're not actually growing. So I would say the most effective exercise where your triceps are the prime mover is the JM press. But as far as like technically speaking, isolation lifts is in single joint movements. Yeah, I could probably get behind overhead work being the most effective, but I don't think it's a big enough gap for me to make that a top priority to get across.
so the long head can experience high tension in a deep stretch. Fourth, for proportional triceps development, you should hit them from a variety of different shoulder angles, including at least one movement with the arms up overhead and one with the arms either down at the sides, like in a push down, and or one movement with the arm held back behind the torso, like a cable kickback. Now, if I had to crown
Yeah, I can get behind that.
just one
Oh, he's picking the one exercise. This is a sneak. He's gonna say JM press.
exercise as the best of the best, it'd have to be the overhead cable tricep extension. This exercise
Saw that one coming. I disagree. It's a great lift, but I would say the easy bar, and depending on how strong you are, the dumbbell variation would be great. The cable's fine as long as you bring a bench to it. A seated stationary bench with back support and a foot support. That's going to be the best it gets. I'd put that way better than just like the standing cable one. I would also say the JM press, the Smith JM press, even the seated dip machine are going to be better. Yeah, but I mean, kind of apples and oranges if you're talking about lateral medial head work and long head work. That's a fine pick to put in S plus tier. A lot of people have grown their triceps very well. That's just a kind of a personal disagreement for me there. I'd put that in A or S tier.
Exercise will grow all three heads very effectively, and it's actually been validated as a superior exercise in long-term hypertrophy studies. And if I had to pick one as the worst of the worst, I guess it'd have to be the dumbbell kickback. It's not that it never has its place, but I do.
Yeah, I agree with that. So he didn't really put anything that low.
Do think there are better options. And you may have noticed that there were no F tier exercises in this video, but there definitely were in my back tier list video. So to make sure that you don't put.
All right, so that is the video. Let me see if I can get myself full screen. There we go. So if you guys enjoyed the video, or if you had any questions, comments, agreements, disagreements, hit me up in the comments. I'll keep an eye out. That was fun. I'll probably do more of these. If you have other videos you want to see me react to or just discuss or whatever, let me know. See you guys in the next one.